Headliner Nation, what is going on? Your boy Kyle, back with the Fantasy Headliners. Today's episode, we're going to be taking a different look at some fantasy statistics. And in this episode, we are going to try to maybe determine, are there some regression candidates? And maybe some candidates this season that are ready to explode but haven't quite done so yet. And maybe you should be looking to trade some of those guys, and maybe you should be looking to trade for some of those guys. But we're not just going to be jumping into a bunch of... Today's video is going to look different. We're not just going to break down a bunch of, maybe efficiency stats for you. We're not just going to break down volume stats or fantasy scores. We're going to go a little bit differently than that. And we are going to look at the top 24 running backs and the top 24 wide receivers. And we are going to look at where do the fantasy points come from and what percentage of their overall fantasy points come from those. For instance, what percentage of Nick Chubb's overall fantasy points come from touchdowns? What come from rushing yards? And we're going to use that to try and find maybe a few guys that there's just something kind of off. And because of that, maybe they're getting ready to explode. Maybe they're getting ready to fall. But we are going to take a look at it right here. Hit that like button for me down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here. And during the video, let me know what you think about this. And maybe some guys that you have on your team that you're looking to move on from as well. Now, I'm going to warn you, there is going to be a lot of information on the screen at one time. It might look a little jumbled together. I tried it several different ways, and honestly, this was the best way that I could do it so we could see everything together and talk through them a little bit more. So if there's a lot going on your screen, I apologize. We're going to try and circle a few things, though, and we're going to try and pinpoint some areas that might be a little bit outside of the normal values that we're looking at here. And let's start talking about rushing yards first. And for rushing yards, there are 4 people whose rushing yards are more than 50% of their overall fantasy score. And it's Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, and Derrick Henry. Now, Chubb, Jacobs, and Henry, I don't think any of us are surprised by that. I mean, these are guys that are on the ground, ground and pound, tons of touches, rushing attempts. I mean, we know who these 3 guys are. Saquon Barkley, that one is crazy, especially considering of the top 12 running backs, his is at 57%. His is higher than any other running back here. Now, if a running back has a majority of their, points from on the ground, it means they've got a lot of yards. And the question would be, do they have all their yards from real high efficiency? Is it based more on the volume? Now, what is it? So if we're looking at only yards, we might have to look at a few different stats. But we're going to stick right here, and let's go on to rushing touchdowns. These are the 3 players who have over 50% of their total score of their rushing attempts, of their total rushing yards towards their score. And then they have a high percentage of rushing touchdowns. Nick Chubb at 36%. 36% of his fantasy points this year come from rushing touchdowns. Josh Jacobs and Derrick Henry right behind him. Now, again, this means that these guys are getting a lot of attempts on the ground, but it also means that they're getting the attempts that matter. Rushing touchdowns and touchdowns in general are always hard to predict from year to year. As a running back from a week-to-week basis in season, though, that can lead us to believe that they're getting the prime time touches. Though they're getting the touches, in the red zone after the 20 that are going to be those high percentage touches to potentially score a touchdown. That's good. Are we going to chase those into next year? Maybe not, but we know who we have this year. We know the team around them. And if there were to be any injuries, we would see what would happen after that. So definitely some things to think about here. But if you look across the board as well, their receptions, their receiving yards, their receiving touchdowns, Nick Chubb, 4, 5, and 0%. Saquon Barkley, a little bit higher, 10, 14, and 0. Josh Jacobs, 8, 11, and then 7 and 13 for Derrick Henry. 13% from receiving yards? Are you kidding me, Derrick Henry? Where have you been all my life with those receptions? Now, overall receptions, the usual candidates here, with the exception of one person that we're going to talk a little bit more about. 18% leads the way for Austin Eckler, who is the RB1 right now. Not surprised. Not surprised. 17% for Christian McCaffrey, also not surprised. 17% for Leonard Fournette. Not really surprised by that too much. 16 for Joe Mixon. And not only does Joe Mixon get 16% of his fantasy points from receptions, but he gets 20% from receiving yards, along with Leonard Fournette at 24, Christian McCaffrey at 28, and then 24 for Austin Eckler. Those guys are leading the way right now in terms of volume through the air. Now, if you look at the stats here, the most even player across the board is Austin Eckler. And I love to see that is the RB1, because that, to me, seeing all that even, all those that evened out fantasy points there is good to me, because now I don't have to worry about him potentially regressing in one area and it becoming an issue, because he's really staying steady in all areas. It's not like he's going crazy in one area right now. Like, he's not above anybody in rushing yards. He's not really above anyone in rushing touchdowns. He leads the way in receptions, but it's really not by that much. Receiving yards, he doesn't lead the way. And then receiving touchdowns, he's at 12%. Now, for receiving touchdowns, Joe Mixon leads the way at 20%. 20% of his total fantasy points are coming from touchdowns. So let's look at everybody we have here. Now that we've circled a few areas that seem to maybe in or out or might be a little bit different, let's just kind of run through the top 12 real quick and talk about it. Mentioned Austin Eckler already. Love that he's even across the board. That is good to me. Nick Chubb is very reliant on rushing yards and rushing touchdowns right now, but that has always been Nick Chubb. That's been no different than ever before. He's always been a high percentage touchdown player, and he's always been a highly efficient running back. So while those scores might seem to say sell Nick Chubb to you, we also know for a fact that Kareem Hunt is on the trading block, that there are teams calling on him, and that there is always a possibility that we see him move on. So am I trading Nick Chubb? Is he a regression candidate? It's possible, because if we were to see his yards or touchdowns dip, we would see his weekly performance dip a little bit. But Kareem Hunt is not getting the touches that he used to in the past. He could be traded, and Nick Chubb has always been a highly efficient player. This isn't just a one off-the-radar year blip for him. He's always been that way. Saquon Barkley. This is a guy right here that I don't want to say that I would consider trading, but if you could get an absolute haul for Saquon Barkley, I would think about it right now. Because 57% of his overall score comes from rushing yards. We're not getting a whole lot in rushing touchdowns. We're not getting a whole lot in the passing game either. And my concern about Saquon Barkley is what happens towards the end of the season if the New York Giants start to find themselves in situations where they become a little bit more one-dimensional and they have to throw the ball more than they can just pound the football. If that happens and we're not seeing that type of production from Saquon Barkley, will we see it later in the year? We also know that Saquon Barkley has, over the last couple of years, gotten banged up quite a bit. And if he's running the football a lot right now, then that could lead to potentially getting banged up even more. So I wouldn't say Saquon Barkley is any type of a regression candidate. But I do want to say that there is a possibility that what we see with Saquon Barkley is what we get right now. And if the rushing yards were to dip at all, will they be offset by something else? So that's what we got to hope for. If you own Saquon Barkley, I would put some feelers out and just say, hey, who out there is looking to make some deals? Who wants to do this or that? And then we'll just kind of try to figure it out from there, because who knows? Maybe you can trade Saquon Barkley for like a Kenneth Walker, and maybe you get like a Mike Williams with it. Obviously when he would come back from injury would be able to be better, or a Kenneth Williams and a Michael Pittman Jr. or something like that. It might not be easy for us to say no to that. It might not be easy for us to say no to some type of a trade like that. What about Josh Jacobs? Kind of the same thing for Josh Jacobs as well. I am a little bit worried about potential regression here because kind of the same thing I'm talking about with Saquon Barkley. Now, the good news is Jacobs is running the football and getting more rushing touchdowns than what Saquon Barkley is. But he's a lot lower over on the receiving side. He's doing almost no damage reception-wise in the passing game. So if those touchdowns were to drop and those rushing yards were to drop because, again, maybe, as the season goes on, the Las Vegas Raiders find themselves in some situations where they have to pass more. Now we find Josh Jacobs kind of falling off a little bit. I don't see Josh Jacobs' value getting any higher than it is right now. So again, regression candidate, absolutely. Will it happen? Maybe not. But right now, if you're going to try to sell Josh Jacobs, this would be the time, but we want to get a haul for him. Let me make it absolutely clear. If we're selling anybody high right now, you are selling them at their current value, not what your league thinks they may be valued at later on. Christian McCaffrey, this to me doesn't mean a whole lot right now because we're going to be looking at Christian McCaffrey in a whole new offense very soon. That is what's going to mean the most for me. So we're going to skip Christian McCaffrey. Breece Hall we're going to skip because he's obviously hurt. Derrick Henry right now, kind of the same thing that I've said about Josh Jacobs. A lot of yards on the ground, a lot of yards rushing touchdown, but this is what Derrick Henry is. This is what this offense is. We've seen this before. This isn't new territory for us. So for me, yep, there could be some regression here, absolutely. But it's also Derrick Henry, and it's also the Tennessee Titans. We know their gameplay. We know what we're doing. If you're selling Derrick Henry because you think he regresses, you're selling him as a top 7 running back. But we're not going to sell Derrick Henry. Leonard Fournette is the RB8. A majority of these points coming over here in the receiving category. Leonard Fournette is a regression candidate for me. Number one, why? Rachaad White's starting to get a little bit more looks. Okay? If he starts to take more and more away from Leonard Fournette in the passing game, we're going to see Leonard Fournette's ceiling absolutely disappear, and he probably drops outside the top 12. Unfortunately, you can't really sell him right now because he doesn't have a whole lot of value with how bad Tampa Bay is playing. So if you're going to sell Leonard Fournette, you're going to have to wait for a huge game. Didn't really cover anything on Ramondre Stevenson here. He is at 49% of his score coming from rushing yards, 24% at rushing touchdowns. But this one, for me, the regression wouldn't come from his performance. It would be coming from Damian Harris getting more involved. So I wouldn't really say he's a regression candidate because he was already a top 15 running back with Damian Harris. So does he regress a little bit? Yeah, maybe he starts to fall back outside the top 12, but it might not be much. Aaron Jones, again, kind of even across the board here in terms of what we're looking at. You can't really sell Aaron Jones for right now for anything, though, because that offense is also performing bad. Joe Mixon is an interesting one because the question is, can he keep up the receiving side of the football where a lot of his points are coming from right now? With Jamar Chase being injured, obviously, I was going to record this video last week, and I'm kind of glad that I waited. With Joe Mixon now dealing without Jamar Chase, I'm holding on to Joe Mixon a little bit longer because I think we could end up seeing the same amount of checkdowns to him. Now, once Jamar Chase gets healthy, at that point, maybe we do take a look at Joe Mixon over the next couple of weeks and say to ourselves, if he's got a couple of big games, if we can get ourselves like a good trade. And the reason that we're talking about this too, I want to emphasize as well, is because a lot of people out there are dealing with multiple injuries right now, which is making it difficult for them to put together full lineups. So if you can trade a Saquon Barkley, a Josh Jacobs, a Joe Mixon, and you can get, maybe one really good running back like a Kenneth Walker, maybe Dameon Pierce is another one. He's starting to kind of regress just a little bit. He might be another one. Dalvin Cook really hasn't blown up all that much yet. Okay. So maybe if you get like one of him and then like a Kareem Hunt or like a Kenneth Walker and like somebody else, like when Zeke starts to get healthy again, maybe you get Kenneth Walker and Zeke and maybe a small wide receiver, or you get like a stud wide receiver and a decent running back. Those might go a lot more towards our lineup than some of these guys that are top 12 players because you're having troubles right now filling out an entire lineup. So Joe Mixon, I love Joe Mixon, but if you could get, again, one of these running backs that's really starting to break out now and starting to show themselves, a Travis Etienne, a Kenneth Walker, guys like that, maybe we see some big games from them in the coming weeks. Maybe we do see them even out a little bit. If you make moves like that now, you could end up getting somebody and make a decent trade out of it. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he's a regression candidate for me as well, just because of everybody in that backfield. Right now, 16% of his points coming from the reception side, receiving yards and receiving touchdowns, and then scoring at 21%. So he's scoring a lot. That's the only thing that's really propping him up right now, and that is a big issue for me. All right, let's move on to the RB2s and take a look at everyone that we have listed there. Again, a whole lot of information. We've been talking for a long time now, so we're going to speed it up just a little bit because we're at like 16 minutes now in this video. So let's start to go through all these guys. Rushing yards right now at 59 or 60%. Dameon Pierce, Miles Sanders, Ezekiel Elliott, Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne's the biggest one here because he's getting a whole lot of his points from rushing yards right now, but that's really the only area that he's been able to make an impact in the game. He's not getting a whole lot of goal line touches until recently, and now with no James Robinson, we're going to see that change. So that 60% there for me is nothing to be concerned about. But for a guy like Ezekiel Elliott, who's got Tony Pollard waiting right behind him, and also, by the way, has 32% of his points coming from touchdowns, that is a concern for me. Miles Sanders, 60% of his points coming from rushing yards. Again, if we see, some of these games start to change to the point where, hey, Philadelphia's got to throw it a little bit more. They got to play from behind. That's going to start to drop some. Dameon Pierce, 59% there. That's quite on the high side as well. Good news for Dameon Pierce as they continue to run the football. But he's getting, does he start to break down at any point in time? Being a rookie, being a guy that's never handled a lot of touches in his career, do we see the efficiency start to drop? Things like that. Those are always concerns. Rushing touchdowns. Jamal Williams right now, 44% of his points coming from touchdowns. Big regression candidate for me. If you own Jamal Williams and not DeAndre Swift, you trade Jamal Williams to the DeAndre Swift owner. Even with Swift coming back, get rid of Jamal Williams, send him to the Swift owner, or if the Swift owner isn't really willing to give you anything right now, just hold on to Jamal Williams, and if Swift goes down again, then you'll make that trade. Zeke Elliott, again, a lot of points coming on touchdowns. Kenneth Walker, 33% as well. All these guys over 30%. Dalvin Cook right at 30%. Talking about receptions now for the RB2s. Antonio Gibson and Najee Harris leading the way right now with 15 and 14% respectfully of their fantasy points coming from receptions. Receiving yards, 23%. Only two players over 20%. 23 for Antonio Gibson, 22 for Travis Etienne. This is good news for Travis Etienne. Good news for Travis Etienne. Because this is a guy that is going to be more of a full-time starter now, where he's going to see a lot more of those touches than he did in the past. And we've already seen him make an impact in the passing game, and now we're going to see hopefully those rushing touchdowns starts to come up. So for me, looking at Travis Etienne, I'm trying to buy him right now. I'm trying to go get him. He is a candidate that could absolutely explode because we're seeing a majority of his fantasy points on the ground from rushing yards, which is great because that means he's done pretty good with his limited touches. Hasn't scored a whole lot, so that score hopefully can only go up from here. Not a huge percentage of his points coming from receptions, but a huge percentage of his points coming from receiving yards. He is a big playmaker out of the backfield, through the air, and on the ground. It doesn't matter. Travis Etienne, to me, is a buy now candidate. And Najee Harris, 18% rushing touchdowns. He's the only running back to have double-digit percentage points go towards his fantasy points from receiving touchdowns. So right now, taking a look at this, Dameon Pierce is a guy that at running back 13 right now, I'm probably also trying to see if you are really stacked at running back and you need a wide receiver. Dameon Pierce is a guy that I might look to trade right now. Miles Sanders is a guy that I would also look to trade right now. Jamal Williams, I'm looking to trade. Dalvin Cook, I'll go for. Nothing really stuck out here for us. Pretty even with rushing touchdowns and rushing yards there. Not really doing a whole lot in the passing game right now, which would be lovely to see him get that going a little bit, and maybe it does at some point in time. But if we see a little bit of those, if we see a little bit of those yards start to creep up again and we get a little bit more towards 60%, maybe we see him start to jump up more towards RB1 status. Khalil Herbert right now, this is a guy that at RB17, you don't even see David Montgomery anywhere in the top 24 right now. Khalil Herbert really should be owned over David Montgomery at this point. I'm not saying to drop either of them. David Montgomery is still the starter, but the question is, at what point can Khalil Herbert take over? We're not seeing anything crazy here right now. 23% touchdowns, but it's not like a 44% like we're seeing another backup running back in Jamal Williams. So it's not like he's artificially inflated by touchdowns or anything right now. He's getting a lot of these yards on the ground, or a lot of these points on the ground, taking a little bit, touch-wise here in the air, but not a ton. Khalil Herbert, if you own David Montgomery, you got to get Khalil Herbert as well. Zeke's hurt right now, so I'm not going to really touch on him too much because I'm not going to tell you to buy or sell a guy that's currently hurt. We kind of got to wait and see what happens when he comes back. Antonio Gibson, taking a look at him right now, 15%. Really a lot of his points coming from the receiving side of the football. He is a guy that more than likely this 37% at rushing yards will see that drop, and we'll need to see the receptions and the receiving yards. He's kind of an guy for me. He's a push. Not really buying or trying to sell him right now unless I get a good value for him. Kenneth Walker, even I don't care what the numbers show here. Kenneth Walker is a buy for me. Mentioned Travis Etienne. James Robinson at RB22. 27% of his points coming from rushing touchdowns. Not super high, but high enough that I don't know if he gets that in New York. Or if he does, he starts to lose a little bit of volume, but maybe he's just getting that number, and maybe he's just getting a lot of those points from rushing touchdowns, and this number starts to go up, but the 51% rushing yard starts to drop. Kareem Hunt is a guy we know he's going to be traded. He's pretty even across the board right now. The big thing is we're not seeing a lot of work in the passing game this year. And then Najee Harris at number 24. Again, for him, you can probably get Najee Harris pretty cheap right now. And that's really the only reason that I would buy Najee Harris, is because I could get him so cheap. If I could have him as like a running back 3 stash on my team, I would absolutely take that. Let's jump over the wide receiver here real quick. Just looking at receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns here. We're just going to circle all the numbers kind of together at this point and talk about a few of these guys. Few things stick out to here for me, and it's specifically about Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Mike Evans, and Deebo Samuel. Because receptions-wise, we're looking at 24, 18, 18, and 19% receptions. And that doesn't seem like a whole lot, right? Nothing crazy about that. But it is when we scoot over and we look at the receiving yards. So while Tyreek Hill is getting 24% of his points for receptions, he's getting 64% from receiving yards. Jalen Waddle, 18% from his receptions, but 54% from receiving yards. Mike Evans is at 18, but 47. Deebo Samuel's at 19, but 46 for receiving yards. All right. Christian Kirk, kind of the same way there. When you look at like receptions and receiving yards, and we're going to touch on why that's just a little bit different here in a second. But looking at receptions and receiving yards, for Tyreek Hill, he's getting more receptions at this point than the other guys, but he's also getting a lot more yards as well. So what this tells me is that because these guys are so far separated, that they're very reliant on big plays right now, which isn't necessarily always a bad thing. But when you pair that up with other guys, when you pair that up with the receiving touchdowns, 10% is the lowest on this page from Tyreek Hill. 14% is the Justin Jefferson at 11%, but 14% from Deebo Samuel, and then you got a 19 and a 19%. What this tells me is that, yes, these guys are bringing about a lot of plays and a lot of yards and a lot of fantasy points on big plays, but they haven't necessarily started scoring yet. And that is something that I am buying on Hill, Waddle, and Evans. that, yes, it's kind of big play dependent on them right now, but they haven't really been scoring. If they start scoring, that is when we will see them start to blow up. So those are kind of candidates I'm looking at right now and saying, I've got an eye on these guys. Now, Justin Jefferson is kind of the same way at this point. I feel like he's just been unlucky. There's not really anything with the numbers that say, yes, we're doing this or that. He just hasn't scored yet. But at 10% and 64 and 24 for Tyreek Hill, that's just a little bit, those numbers are a little bit different than Justin Jefferson, maybe a little bit comparable. I don't think Justin Jefferson is going to get sold to you as quickly as though it's what you could get like a Tyreek Hill. Now, is there anybody here that I'm looking at potentially selling? Well, that would be dependent on if they are touchdown dependent. Well, you see 29% here, kind of leading the way for Stephon Diggs, but we're at 52% of his points coming from yards. So I'm fine with this 29. 20%, not bad for Cooper Kupp. 30% for Jamar Chase, tied for highest here out of this group. But again, 52% receiving yards, so we're not seeing a big change there. Devontae Adams, 30%, but 51% on his yards. And kind of with Christian Kirk, when you look at it and look across the board, Christian Kirk and Devontae Adams are very similar. So not getting a whole lot of receptions, big plays, scoring touchdowns. That is where we say, okay, what if they don't keep scoring touchdowns? What happens at that point? That is when we start to look at these guys as being regression candidates. So am I selling Devontae Adams right now? No. I'm probably going to keep him and just hold out and say, okay, this guy is going to keep it going. There's no way he doesn't. Am I selling Christian Kirk right now? Probably. Probably trying to sell Christian Kirk. And don't get me wrong, Christian Kirk was a guy that was a sleeper for us in the draft guide. We loved Christian Kirk. Loved him draft season. We're not super surprised by this performance. We are, however, surprised how high the performance is. We were thinking more wide receiver 2 status, not wide receiver 11 status, all right? So we'll see what happens with Christian Kirk. Probably trying to trade him a little bit right now. Unfortunately, Debo's hurt. Mike Williams is hurt. Marquise Brown is hurt. Jamar Chase is hurt. So a lot of people that are hurt right now in this list. So it's hard to really, talk about some of them because some of them you're not really trading for or trading away right now because their value is way too low. One thing I'll show you here that's a lot different than the other slide is that for these wide receiver 2s, it's all about scoring, and it's not about the touchdowns. The touchdowns are a lot lower than the top guys, and the receiving yards are a lot higher. So these guys aren't really scoring, but they're getting quite a bit of yards right now. Tyler Boyd, we look at him. 57% of his points coming from receiving yards, but only 19 coming from receptions. The Duve, 36 from receiving yards, only 13% from receptions. Michael Pittman Jr. is a big one to mention here, and we'll talk about him in just a second. But for Tyler Boyd and the Duve for me is a regression candidate. And we've kind of talked about this in the start and sit videos. He's getting basically no volume, and he's predicated on big plays and scoring touchdowns. 23% of his points coming from touchdowns right now. The Duve for me, big regression candidate. 57 and 19, Tyler Boyd. For me right now, we're sticking with Tyler Boyd. Not knowing how long Jamar Chase is going to be out, these numbers don't mean nearly as much to me with Tyler Boyd. CeeDee Lamb, 60%. Seems kind of high, right? But then you look down and you get 63 for A.J. Brown, 65 for Chris Olave, 61 for Lockett, 64 for Juju, 65 for Pittman, 63 for Higgins, 62 for McLaurin. That's the big difference between the wide receiver 1s and the wide receiver 2s. The wide receiver 1s are scoring more. The wide receiver 2s are scoring less, but a bigger part of their percentage is coming from their yards. So when we're looking for a wide receiver 2, we're looking for the yards. How many receiving yards are these guys getting for you? The biggest buy candidate on this list right now is Michael Pittman Jr. for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's got a new quarterback and nobody knows what to expect. If you're going to trade for Michael Pittman, you do it right now because I don't think his price is going to get lower. The only other time it's going to get lower is if you luck out, Sam Ehlinger plays like absolute crap this weekend, and then you go get him afterwards. but 30% of his points coming from receptions and 65 coming from receiving yards. And to you, that might sound a little high. And you might be saying, Kyle, you've kind of talked about this already. What would be the difference between that and everybody else? Well, the biggest difference between that and everybody else is that he's only got 8% of his fantasy points coming from receiving touchdowns. That is the lowest of the top 12 or top 24 wide receivers. The next two closest participants, Tyreek Hill at 10% and Justin Jefferson at 11%. In fact, when you look at Justin Jefferson, his 11% is, a few points higher, but then he's getting 21% from receptions and 59% from receiving yards. If you add a couple more points to Michael Pittman, or a couple more touchdowns to Michael Pittman, dude is inside the top 12. He's literally 2 scores away from potentially being a top 12 wide receiver. And in fact, while we're talking about it right now, why don't we go look that up and tell you exactly what it would look like if we could get a couple of more points out of Michael Pittman? Because as I mentioned, right now he's sitting at wide receiver 21. Correct? That's what I have on the screen. 22 on the screen. Excuse me, wide receiver 22. My apologies. So he's at wide receiver 22 right now. Okay? In a half PPR format, he has got 73.5 points. So if you were to take 73.5 points and you were to add another 12 to it, that would give you 85.5 points. That would make him the wide receiver 10 on the season. Michael Pittman, for as up and down as he has been, he is 2 touchdowns away from being a top 12 wide receiver. He is the guy that on this screen right now is the most important buy now candidate. Yes, it is a concern that we're switching to a different quarterback. He is still the wide receiver 1 in this offense. Paris Campbell's had back-to-back good games. It does not matter. I want Michael Pittman, and I want as much of him as I can possibly get for the rest of the season. And like I said, right now is your best shot at getting him the absolute cheapest that is going to happen this year. So, hopefully y'all enjoyed that video. Hopefully y'all took something from it. And hopefully y'all go out there and can make some deals in your league and push yourself to fantasy championship stardom. I'm going to get out of here, though. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your weekend. I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners. Peace out, stay safe, and stay healthy.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game. Y'all stuck on third down. Your content's plain Jane. Headliners on top now. We gonna move and change. Podcast off the rip. Draft guide, so legit. Fantasy world, our game tight. You know we about that chub life. Stuck in a rut and you need some motivation. Head to the channel for this Headliner Nation.
I'm a headliner.